Good morning, afternoon from New York, afternoon, I think, in Europe, and in Ecuador, I think also midday. Welcome to the session of the Explorers. Today we have a very intriguing session, at least for me. It's a very new topic that we're going to treat today. I'm very happy about it. Today we have with us Lucy Coatman and Esther Wilson. Let me introduce them to you. Lucy has an MLit MA from the University of St. Andrews, Central European University. She's a historian of the 19th and early 20th century Austria who lives and works in Vienna. She's currently writing the first English language biography of Baroness Mary Betzera. Recently, Lucy worked with Secrets of History for the forthcoming episode about the Mayerling incident and the Scottish Ballet for the production of The Scandal of Mayerling. Additionally, Lucy is coordinating editor of the project and monograph Maurice Nahr, hope I'm saying it correctly, photographer of Habsburg, Klimt, and Wittgenstein, catalog Raisonné at the Klimt Foundation in Vienna. Lucy, thank you for being here and for accepting our invitation. And we have also Esther Wilson. Esther, funded by the White Rose College of the Arts and Humanities, her research is interested in the intersections between public history, performance studies, history on screen, and the digital humanities. In an age of increasing global dependence and integration, Esther's work explores from a public history standpoint the impact of evolving digital technologies on the formation, circulation, and public consumption of historical ideas and knowledge in contemporary societies. With an understanding of public history as performance and drawing across the digital sphere, her research considers the significance of Hamilton, an American musical's performativity, digitally and transmedial engagement with the past. Prioritizing both public experience and academic practice, her work hopes to encourage new understandings and conceptual frameworks relevant to the public history of today. Esther has also some publications involving sartorial and film and television studies, as well as growing interest involving dance and public memory and agency. So thank you, Esther, also for being here. So as I mentioned before, this topic is completely new for explorers, and we are very happy to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jamina. That's fabulous. Yeah, so the idea of today's session is Lucy and I are both going to be sharing some thoughts on and papers sort of from our experience of dealing with dance and history and this sort of conversations we have around performance and performances of history. If anybody has any questions, those who are here or anybody watching on a recording has any questions, feel free to send them over as well. But hopefully we'll just have a nice discussion sort of centered around our experience and hopefully broaden out some of these ideas in the future. Lucy, is there anything you'd like to say?
To introduce or?
Either way, take it away. If you'd like to go first, or I can go first, whatever.
You know what? I'll just get it over and done with. then it's out of the way. I just ask for a little patience, firstly, because I have two cats who are behaving now, but usually when I do these things, they cause chaos. And secondly, I actually got sick today, so my brain is a little bit fried, but I will try my best. So I'm just going to share my screen. Is that working for everyone? My slides?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to be talking a bit about my experience with the Mayerling Ballet. So this is a ballet which retells the murder-suicide of Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria and his 17-year-old mistress, Baroness Mary Betzera. So I know a lot of people are not super familiar with this story, so I'll just give a really brief rundown. If anyone has any questions about it, feel free to ask me or to drop me an email, because it's a story that's quite difficult to condense into, one little paragraph explaining it. So basically, Crown Prince Rudolph and Mary were found dead on the 30th of January, 1889. And there'd been a whole lead up to this, and that Rudolph, he was the only heir to the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. And he had a childhood which it was pretty much abuse. That's what you can say at the hands of his tutor. So this really set the basis for his later mental issues and anxiety and depression that led him to make this decision. But he also had quite a disastrous marriage. It was very happy at first, but that really broke down, especially after he actually infected his wife with gonorrhea and rendered her infertile. So that wasn't a great first step. And he was also very different to his father, the emperor, in that he had quite liberal ideals and liberal views that got him blocked basically from acting in any kind of political position in the empire. So this is quite frustrating for him, especially he was a very sensitive and also very intellectually minded person who wanted to go to university. And again, as the heir to the throne, was actually expected to be a soldier. He was raised as a soldier really from the moment of his birth. So again, this was another frustration for him. And it basically just seems, I mean, to condense it all very quickly, it seems that all of this just kind of eventually exploded, all of this emotional turmoil. He actually offered the suicide pact to his main mistress, Mitzi Casper, who basically laughed him off. And then later realized, oh, this is serious, and went to the police, who didn't listen to her. And then he met Baroness Mary Vetcherer. So she was 17, a very young girl who was noble in that her father was a diplomat and eventually was raised to the status of baron. But, you know, they're not from the old aristocracy. So they had a weird position in Vienna, in that they were very rich and they were the hosts of a lot of really fabulous parties that all of society wanted to go to. But they were also othered because Mary's mother came from a kind of Levantine background. She was known as the richest heiress in Constantinople. So they had quite an ambivalent position in society. And Mary basically saw the crown prince from afar at the races and wrote in her diary, "A passion has been born." So it's kind of like teenagers today with Harry Styles or whoever is cool, I have no idea. And she started to collect photographs, and she had a stroke of luck in that her uncle was having an affair with Rudolph's cousin. And so she had a letter sent to Rudolph through this cousin, who then acted as the go-between. So they finally met in November 1888, had a very short affair that was only physically consummated about 2 weeks before their deaths in January 1889. And then they were found dead, and there was this huge cover-up because it was just such a scandal to, you know, firstly that a crown prince kills himself, a Catholic crown prince, and also shoots a 17-year-old mistress. So Mary's body gets snuck out at the hunting lodge. Her uncles have to carry the body like she's still alive, kind of propped up between them in the carriage, and she's buried, you know, kind of, I'm struggling to speak English, but in the mist and the dark in the early hours of the morning, whereas the crown prince gets a huge state Catholic funeral. And Mary's presence at Miling can basically never be known. Of course, people start to talk and the truth starts to come out, but the problem is that then you get a lot of conspiracy theories. So you've got anything from the Freemasons assassinated Rudolph to actually they survived and they escaped to America. And actually Rudolph became, I can't remember which American president, but he became an American president and all of this kind of thing. And it's, of course, then attracted the attention of a lot of movies and theater and eventually a ballet. So just to briefly speak about my experience with it, if I can change the slide. Yes, there we go. So I was actually doing my bachelor degree in St. Andrews in theology, just because I found it super interesting. But my dream was always to be in musicals. And a friend of mine sent me a musical about Empress Elizabeth of Austria, who's Crown Prince Rudolph's mother. And then I started reading all of the books and found out about the Miling incident. And this is really bad, although I suppose it worked out in the end. I started skipping my lectures so that I could read about Miling. And eventually, as you can see, I got to visit it. Stupid little 21-year-old Lucy didn't check the opening time, so it was actually closed. So I traveled all the way there to not get there. But anyway, a long story short, I moved to Vienna actually to study at the conservatory because my dream was then to play Mary Vetcherer in the stage musical version of the story. And eventually realized that actually I'd rather sit in an archive, went to do my master's, started publishing on the topic, started writing my book and speaking on podcasts and this kind of thing, or going on the TV. So that's just a bit of background of how I got there. So the ballet itself, so it had its premiere, funnily enough, for such a dark story on Valentine's Day in 1978. So it was choreographed by Kenneth Macmillan. It premiered at the Royal Opera House, and the music is by Franz Liszt. So this is really fitting because he's the perfect era, the perfect location for this kind of story. And Kenneth Macmillan collaborated with a writer called Gillian Freeman, who claims, there's a documentary, and she claims that absolutely everything in the ballet can be verified. We'll come back to that a little bit later. But it's a very cinematic ballet. It's very, I mean, Esther can probably talk about this a bit more because she is a dancer, but it's not one of those typical ballets where at the end of a dance, they come forward and bow and kind of break the fourth wall. It's very much just cinematic, goes the whole way through. And for me, it was unlike any ballet that I'd seen before. It's very intense, very emotional, and just extremely psychological. Now Amadeus the cat has arrived to cause chaos. Macmillan himself came across this story because he watched one of the movies, which was highly romanticized. And then he bought a book on the Habsburg monarchy for his wife and then actually read it first before she could read it and was presented with the real story, which was actually really gruesome. It's very likely that Crown Prince Rudolph did not love Baroness Mary Betscherer. He was just too scared to die alone and was looking for someone to do the suicide pact with him because he knew if he had someone's blood on his hands, he would have to go through with his own death eventually. So this kind of blew his mind and he thought, okay, I have to tell the story as accurately as possible. So hi, Amadeus. So for the most part, it is very historically accurate. Some parts are, of course, condensed or kind of made really over dramatic. So for example, in the ballet, Rudolph is constantly taking drugs. He's always injecting himself with something, which is a myth that's kind of been passed down in the historiography as well. But if you actually go and look at the court records of the pharmacy, you will see that he actually wasn't taking that much morphine. His mother, on the contrary, was taking it a lot more often. And at this time, you know, he didn't have to go to some kind of backstreet dealer. It was a completely normalized medicine. So it really over-exaggerates that. I think it also really over-exaggerates the sexual relationship between Mary and Rudolph because the first time they're alone, she just kind of appears and takes off her coat and she's in her underwear and they have this really sexy pas de deux, which is very intense. So they're actually, this has been a bit problematic in the historiography, and Mary has been really put down to be nothing more than a kind of high-class prostitute who's sleeping with the entire aristocracy, and she's had a million affairs at the age of 17, which actually we can verify was not the case if you look at her letters, because her first sexual contact was with Rudolph a couple of weeks before Meiling. So yeah, I understand why they wanted to give this whole sexual chemistry thing, because it does work really well on the stage, but the reality was a bit different. You know, she was pretty much a child who was manipulated by a much older man. He was 30. But at the same time, I think this does come through in the choreography. For example, there are scenes where they're both holding the gun and he will push her head towards the gun. So it's kind of like he's forcing her into this decision with him. Yes, so it's a ballet that you typically have to watch more than once. Even I, as someone who specialized on the topic, had to watch it a couple of times before I could get everything. And some people don't like that, but I think that's actually a really beautiful way to really dive into a story and dive into the choreography. Funnily enough, or not funnily enough, actually, it's really rather tragic. The choreographer died backstage at the performance of Meiling. So he was really just in life and death wrapped up in this story. So in terms of my work with this, it started off really informal. There was a production done in Warsaw by the Polish National Ballet, and I got an Instagram message from a dancer called Elizabeta, who you can see her here, and she told me that she was about to perform the role of Mary in Warsaw. And I thought, okay, why is this random person messaging me? But eventually it turned out she was just super hungry to really find out the historical facts behind the story, to find out more about the character that she was about to embody on stage through dance. And she wanted to make it as accurate as possible, given the limitations of the choreography, of course, but so that she could psychologically get into the mindset of this figure. And so she would always be in touch with me. We would talk a lot online about, you know, recent updates in my research and new letters I'd found, and I was really happy to share her those letters because she was just so passionate about the story. And I think it just really showed, and I've had further proof of this, that when you have, you know, a ballet or a piece of theater that's based on history, the cast are actually super hungry for this information. They really want to, you know, delve into this properly and do it properly and do justice to the historical figures. So I actually didn't get to see her first performances, but then they performed it again, and that's us. So she actually then performed again on the anniversary of the Meiling incident itself. I got to go to Warsaw. We met a couple of times before the performance to just discuss Mary Vetra in detail. She was super obsessed. It was really great to see. And she, yeah, even though the ballet is behind her now, it seems to be a story that's not left her. And the really beautiful thing is that we're now kind of really close friends. So it's a ballet that I've noticed throughout my work that also just really connects people. I guess, I mean, of course, it's a very intense story, but it's a very human story. It really touches on a lot of issues and issues that really connect all of us in some way. So then I've advised other dancers since, so it can be really informal. You know, they might just message me and say, hey, have you got any kind of book recommendations? Or they want to have a Zoom meeting or this kind of thing. Or they even offer to pay out of their own pocket, which is really sweet because, of course, it is my work, but it leads me to think about, okay, should more ballet companies, you know, if they're dealing with a historical ballet, should they really think about bringing in an expert on the topic if there is one available? So I know that in Poland, they had someone come in to talk to the cast about Meiling, but apparently it was kind of dodgy. I don't know the details. So again, it just raises these kind of questions because you see that the desire is there from the part of the dancers. What should the ballet companies really be doing about this? Yeah, so then the next time I got to work with it, hi Brynhilde the cat, it was in Scotland. So the Scottish Ballet did a shortened version of the Meiling Ballet. So the thing is that you need a huge ensemble for this. You've not just got the multiple characters in the Habsburg court itself, you've got a huge ensemble to really, you know, show the grandeur of the courts of Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elizabeth. So what they did was they basically cut out all of the big ensemble scenes and they focus on the pas de deux of Rudolph with the various women in his life. So, of course, Mary, but also his main mistress, Mitzi Kasper, his wife, his mother, which on one level, it was really beautiful because it was really raw and intense and focused so microscopically on these personal relationships. On the other hand, it was a bit problematic, and I just spoke to people who had then seen it who had no background with the story, and they were honestly completely confused. And I found a really good quote actually from a journalist, because when the original production was performed in the 1970s, there were critics who complained that it was just too long and there were scenes that could be cut. But actually, so Mary Clark, writing for The Guardian, said, it's easy after one or two viewings to say this or that scene must go, but patience and understanding bring rewards. Every scene tells something about Rudolph and the court of Vienna in his time. So that's completely true. If you know the story, then you can go on and watch this production. You're completely fine. If you don't, it can be a bit complicated. But the Scottish Ballet did something really great, and I was really honored that they asked me to do this. So they firstly asked me to do an interview for the program, which you can kind of see on the right. I don't know if I actually said that big quotes as fancily as that, but that's what they put there. And so it was an interview of about an hour. And of course, I had to prepare because I'd done podcasts before, but nothing quite like this. So I think I spent a week just reading and rereading primary sources so that, you know, I could give correct answers to their questions. It was printed kind of over 4 pages in the program. And this was really special to me just because, you know, I had this theater background. I always thought, okay, I want to see my name in a professional theater program. And it happened, just not in the way that I originally expected it. But it did teach me something, and that's that as a historian, you sometimes have to be a bit more assertive, because when I got the proofs back, there were about 3 or 4 kind of misquotes of me. So for example, I said that Crown Prince Rudolph's tutor would lock him in the lion's nature reserve and tell him that wild boars were going to eat him. And this was when Crown Prince Rudolph was about 3 or 4 years old. And this nature reserve somehow became a small room. And Marie Valerie's diary, so Marie Valerie was the sister of Rudolph. Marie Valerie's diary became Emperor Franz Josef's personal correspondence. And I know for sure I did not say that. So I did give them my corrections, but I was still I am a young historian, but I was a lot younger then. This was already a couple of years ago, and I was really shy and I was not assertive enough. And so I gave my corrections, but it was just way too late. Everything had gone into print. So my lesson I learned from this was definitely if something doesn't quite add up, then just speak up, and it's not a problem. No one's going to be mad. But yeah, I also learned them from another historian, because I spoke about this to her. She's a senior historian, and she said, yeah, just get used to the press constantly misquoting you. So I think that's something as well that public historians must have to keep in the mind some of the times. We also did a podcast together with Rex Factor. I think they're quite popular in the UK, and together with one of the dancers who played Crown Prince Rudolph. It was really interesting to hear how the dancers prepared themselves without getting in contact with a historian. So, you know, a lot of reading books and doing as much research as possible, which, given how much time they spend in rehearsal, is actually really admirable. And again, just consistently, I've seen, whether it's been through informal messages or emails or Zoom meetings, or actually being brought in to speak to the cast, that as I've said, the dancers are hungry for this. They really have the desire. And so it's become quite clear to me that there is a need. If you have a historical production, whether that's a ballet, a musical, theatre, whatever, aside from issues of historical accuracy, of course, it's that the cast generally really, really care about this. Then we've got the Hungarian National Ballet. I actually wasn't involved in this production whatsoever, but it's just another case of the humanity of this piece and how it brings people together, because Paul, the blonde guy on the right, is now one of my close friends. And we met because he was conducting the ballet in Budapest. And we followed each other on Instagram, realized that we were both nerds about this topic. And yeah, then we just got speaking, and then I got to meet one of the dancers playing Rudolph. So I've just tried to condense everything there. But as I said, it's just such a moving story that really speaks to a lot of people, even though it's something that took place in 1889. It also taught me that your research can be unknowingly helpful, because now there's a theater piece about miling happening in New York, and I found out from the person who wrote it that my research is being used. So you never quite know where your publications are going to go. So my general thoughts on this, and maybe something that we can talk about later, is just, it's more of a question of historical accuracy. You know, how much should historians worry about historical accuracy in theatrical or film retellings of an event? Because, for example, with miling, there are a lot of films that are just not historically accurate at all. The musical, for example, is really, really cheesy and romanticized. And on one level, I really love sitting back and enjoying it. And I'm not always super hung up on historical accuracy. On another level, the question for me is kind of the ethics of it. At least with a story like that, you know, you've basically got a young girl who's being groomed by a much older man, and is then being extorted for money in the process, or used to extort money from Rudolph in the process, and the whole cover-up of it, which is already a huge ethical problem. So I kind of have this inner conflict of, yeah, I get to sit down with my popcorn and be entertained, and this other side of, okay, this story has been mistold so many times, and especially Mary Vetcher's story has been mistold so many times. You know, where is the balance? Where is the fine line? You know, dramatic effect, star-crossed lovers kind of story. Yeah, so that was a really quick, condensed rundown of my experience with history and ballet. So if anyone has any questions, I think maybe Esther is going to do her presentation. We can open it up. I'm not sure how it will work, but yeah, thank you for listening to me ramble with my migraine coming on.
Thank you, Lucy, so much. I think the question you posed actually was one of the questions I was going to ask you at the end. I think
Nice.
we can discuss that, especially when we talk about like entertainment and those kinds of industries. How much,
Yeah.
how flexible are you to gain ratings and stuff like that with historical accuracy? I think that's a very important question that, I mean, it's not answered, but I think it's good always to discuss it, especially when you talk about, like, I don't know, TV shows or things like that. So, thank you for that. Esther, please.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you, Lucy. That was really great. I'm actually intrigued by a number of things that are maybe some overlapping themes actually with mine. And mine's quite different. Let me get my slides up and then I will share my screen. I'm also using Google Slides, so hopefully this works fine. Are we coming through okay? Great. My notes are just to the side of me, so if I keep looking to the side, that is why. I've also stolen some of these slides from a paper I gave a little while ago. So I wasn't planning on giving this a fancy title, but I found one from an old paper on the topic, so please enjoy. So I'm going to be talking about recreating a historical dancer called Lola Montez today. As Jamina said, my name is Esther Wilson and I'm a third-year PhD student within York's Institute for Public Understandings of the Past. My thesis uses Hamilton, the American musical, to develop understandings of performance and social media within the public history field. But today, this is my topic instead, recreating the historical dancer with Leeds museums and galleries. Let's see if this will, wonderful. So you can see here, this is a picture of Lotherton Hall, and there's myself here with the Lord Mayor of Leeds, my castmate, Emily, who's playing my character's sister, some of the other volunteers involved in the project, and then also the Lord Mayor of Leeds. So I can't say that this is a big stage like some of the ones that Lucy's been talking about. But I'd known community curator Stephanie, who I'm sort of to the right of me on that picture there, for a few months when she approached me about getting involved in her upcoming community project, Homes of the Gascoignes. So this is based at Lotherton Hall, which can be seen here near Leeds in England. And the exhibition not only aimed to broaden visitors' understandings of the Gascoigne family who owned the house, but sought to use community volunteers in order to share the stories of some of the real people behind the grand facades of the country estates. I have interest in both heritage and dance, and this is where I came into Stephanie's schemes. The word is, but sort of spoiler alert, I dance ballet, I teach ballet. I have an interest in performance in many different ways, as well as with regards to history. So as soon as she heard that I was a dancer and had some experience of doing sort of extras work for film and TV, she was like, right, Esther, I've got a job for you. And thus a project was born. So this sort of short paper considers how we preserve, access and recreate in some senses intangible cultural history in the form of dance and choreography. So I'm going to be thinking about performance, specifically the categories of choreography and costume, and be thinking about how public historians need to think more critically about engagement with embodied histories and sort of lived experiences of the past in that sort of a sense. So I've said I'm playing this person called Lola Montez. Who actually was she? So Lola Montez was born Eliza Rosanna Gilbert, and she's most well known today for her reputation as a 19th century international dancer and courtesan. Her escapades of absconding from a strict Presbyterian boarding school, mysteriously missing men, and evocative dances, as well as some involvement in European Revolution, are some of the key legacies left behind within public general knowledge. I'm not going to go massively deeply into history because I would be here for a very long time. But what is lesser known about this dazzling Spanish dancer, as she styled herself, was that she was actually a young Irish gentlewoman from the estate of Castle Oliver in County Limerick, Ireland, and she would finish her life as a penniless charity worker and a penitent Protestant. Her life story is somewhat astounding. So Montez was ousted by polite society. She never went to Spain and she never actually took ballet training, but she managed to tour the stages of the world, become Ludwig of Bavaria's revolutionary Countess of Landsfeld, Lucy, you'll have to correct me on my pronunciation there, and develop an international voice in women's etiquette and toilette as well. She wrote a book on it called The Art of Beauty. My task as public history researcher and as a dancer was to tell these stories about Lola Montez And I personally hope to maybe change some public perceptions as part of a 2-hour heritage event. Today, I'm just going to be focused on the dance portion of the afternoon, thinking, as I said, about costume and choreography. Various challenges presented themselves. Not only was I bursting onto the acting scene, playing a real historical individual, but in creating an event which sort of aimed to effectively communicate the past to a very unknown visiting public, I had to negotiate between my largely non-performative experience in the heritage industry, so I'd worked in museums for quite a number of years, but then my also normative forms of academic sort of research and communication, and then bring in my performance experience, which was previously not at all related to this sort of context. It meant that I actually had to identify and call into question sort of personal assumptions about how I could do heritage and do history in practice performatively as a performer. And how was I to recreate a historic dance? Because Lola was a dancer, as I said, and she was really famous for a particular piece called the spider dance. How was I supposed to recreate that as part of her character when there's minimal and very conflicting source material, as I'm going to be talking about? And in some ways, the dance is almost this intangible piece of history, of almost a cultural heritage. And it really made me think, how do you even communicate ideas about the past anyway? And Lucy's paper was really, really interesting to exploring that from another angle. So the two key pieces I'm going to be focusing on are costume and the choreography. So you've already seen my costume here a little bit in the red. So the visual element of the performance piece, so the costuming, was really key in setting the right aesthetic environment for the actual choreography that I was going to perform. In some ways, this was made very easy for me. So my dress that you can see here on sort of full completion on the right, in development in the middle, was actually designed and executed by Northern Ballet's costumer, Julia Anderson. And it was designed to echo the attire that you can see in the contemporary portrait of Montez on the left-hand side here. I mean, Julia is an absolutely fantastic professional ballet costumier. Her work is absolutely exquisite. And she created, you can see here, this sort of 1840s silhouette beautifully. And there's no need for corseted underpinnings either in actually creating this. Now, I've worn 1840s day wear for film and television as a sort of extra or background artist, as it's sometimes styled. And I really marveled at the difference here. Typically, when I've worn sort of recreations of 1840s clothing, it's been very restrictive. Think tight corsets, think lots and lots of skirts. But actually, the way that this dress made me feel as a performer, as a character, was really, really different. You can see a short video clip here of me getting quite excited about my costume when it was in development. Now, I don't quite have the dark hair for Montez, but we make it work. Now, one wardrobe choice that I did make myself, you can see looking at the bottoms of those pictures, was character shoes for the performance. So these are the heeled shoes I'm wearing on the right-hand side, and you'll see they look very different to what the depiction of Montez has on the left, or the sort of the white ballet flats on the middle when we're in the decision-making process. This decision was partially centered around practicality, but it made me think a lot more about how we think about sort of authenticity. Ironic for what we just brought up with Lucy's paper, when it comes to public history, both more generally, but also sort of in part of embodied narrativity. Now, we don't actually know what Lola wore for her performances of the spider dance when it debuted. And it would have been wonderful to have known a little bit more about how she herself navigated the balance of different sort of appearance and costume and theatrics back in the 19th century. But what I do know is that the shoes depicted on the left in this contemporary portrait would have been pretty much impossible for me to have replicated. Partially, this is down to sort of aesthetics and technical differences in point shoe use over the last 200 or so years. My modern point shoes would not have cut it at all. They would have looked and felt very, very different. But we actually also don't believe that Lola ever danced on point, because there's no evidence she actually ever sort of obtained sufficient training. Also, the style of point work at the time, integrated within romantic ballet pieces, was extremely different to the vibe and the feel of the spider dance, and also extremely different to the point work that I would be used to today. So there wasn't really a way to reconcile wearing sort of what looks like point shoes, and you just think a little bit more out of the box. So as Lola was sort of known to style herself as this Spanish dancer, I actually took the artistic license to wear my character shoes, and these are shoes that I'd worn as part of the Spanish dance from the Nutcracker, which is a ballet generally understood to be set in sort of 19th-ish century Germany, which was actually not too different. I'm not a German historian, to some of the places that Lola's own history took her. So the character shoes, as you can see on the right, have a low heel, have a real striking black appearance in contrast to the white tights, and they're not really fitting for 1840s in terms of historically accurate footwear. But as the performer and the public historian in charge of the choice, it kind of actually felt like I'd made the right decision to rely more on the hair and the dress silhouette as the key indicators of period, and actually ignoring the footwear. And I do think the shoes added something to the character piece in their own way. Not only just in terms of the sort of the overall appearance, but in terms of the action within the piece, which I'm going to show you in a few minutes, and also as an indicator of tone. The character shoes seem to facilitate a more accessible contemporary performance feel, which could be more subtly sexualized, whilst retaining the practicality and acceptability within sort of a modern dance context. So I defend this position. We're absolutely down to discuss it, but I completely defend my position of opening the can of worms of historical authenticity here. It feels to me that, you know, we cannot always represent the past literally. It doesn't matter whether you're doing it in a museum, whether you're doing it through ballet, whether you're doing it on film and television, whether you're doing it on a musical, whether you're doing it as part of a sort of reenactment event. You can't literally represent the past. And it actually isn't what we always want to do. Instead, we want to translate and tell these stories in ways that make sense to modern audiences. And sometimes we have to compromise. So, moving on to the actual choreography. I had to animate this visual material recreation. Creating the dance itself was perhaps the biggest challenge. Fellow volunteers were very excited to see the choreography unfold. Supposedly, the spider dance being as scandalous as her reputation, and no doubt that's what other visitors might have expected too. The piece reportedly debuted in Australia to conflicting levels of public reception. On the one hand, this idea of an audience hurling golden nuggets at her, and on the other, shock and appall at the evocative sexual performance and revealing public nudity. It's actually quite difficult to understand exactly what the piece consisted of, but it's so called for Lola's swishing skirt movements, which you can see here a little bit on this sort of contemporary depiction. Shaking the skirt as if arachnids were falling out of her petticoats and she then stomped on them. In so doing, supposedly revealing what was or was not underneath her layers of clothing. The only footage I actually had to inspire me was a rather uninspiring museum-made one on YouTube. Probably works great from a sort of heritage sector context, but as a dancer, it didn't quite tick the boxes for what I was looking for in terms of creativity. I had to consider a few practical considerations in addition to actually my own performance capability, because this isn't really a style that I would usually be doing. Firstly is music availability, and then also the restrictions of time and space. The initial thought was actually to choose music by Franz Liszt, which Lucy mentioned. He was actually one of the men that Lola was known to supposedly have had a relationship with. Actually, Lola was supposedly the inspiration for Arthur Conan Doyle's Iron Adler, if that helps to add anything to the tone. But Liszt's music seemed to match neither the length nor the tone that I was really looking for. Reflecting on Lola as a whole, it seemed to me that the spider dance sought to have a bit of a flirtatious and stereotypically Hispanic feel. The music from Kitri's Act 4 variation from the ballet Don Quixote seemed to fit the bill a little bit better for stereotypical tone, length and accessibility within the event. Kind of supported also by this idea of Kitri as a feisty young heroine in love. A little bit of a tone similarity there. There was little question, though, that I would not be aiming at imitating the 21st century understandings of burlesque or cabaret, for which Lola was supposedly one of many forerunners. Conveniently, for the ethical comfort boundaries of both myself and the museum environment, I settled on being unconvinced by surviving press evidence that Lola certainly revealed a lack of underwear in the piece. This actually came because I was informed by the curator, Stephanie, that much of this press was actually written supposedly by a rather dominating Jesuit order who'd publicly criticised Montez since her controversial part in Bavarian politics. And actually, with some awareness of generally sort of dance development over the years and 19th century etiquette, I settled on a choreography that blended balletic Spanish style movements, which could have been seen as evocative by contemporary standards, but actually rather tame by modern expectations. I know, for example, today, if you go see a ballet like the picture of Myling that Lucy showed, you have these huge 180-degree extensions, for example. You would not have seen those within a romantic ballet. You would not have seen those really until the last couple of decades, to be quite honest. So things like that, for example, would not have been the part of the routine for Lola. That's why I opted for generally lower leg lines, which would have been more suited to the period and sort of the romantic ballets, but with a little bit more dynamism and sense of attitude. And for the icing on the cake, Julia actually arranged for the thankfully artificial spiders to be sewn and loose in the skirt netting. So as I swished the skirts, I was actually able to quite literally stomp on the spiders, and that was a movement made all the more effective by the character shoes. We might not have known quite what the dance looked like in the 1840s, but both the visitors and the Lodkin team seemed pleased with the results of my interpretation. And I actually have a 1-minute clip if it works. I don't know if the volume will, but we will give it a whirl. So you can see how I'm really quite restricted by this is in the middle of a longer workshop on a rather unstable floor as well in a museum environment. Let's see if this works. Oh, we don't want that to start again. Closing reflections. Where does this all leave us? There's so many different things I'd love to go into here, but obviously we are restricted by the confines of today's sort of event. This kind of felt like a bit of a practical experiment in negotiating truth and fiction in a blend of past and present. And the experience actually really encouraged me and my own research in a number of ways. Having long wanted to explore costume and choreography as part of public history, the project was a really fantastic opportunity for reflection upon my own practice as a public historian. And it seems kind of to me that the embodiment and the sense of an act consciously of a dance-based performance brought something new when thinking about not just Lola or theatre history, but kind of brings something to how we approach the past as an embodied space generally. And it kind of reminds me that history is not comprised of just names or places or even sort of feelings, but lived experiences which actually include bodily movement and the fleeting senses of physical presence. It reminds me of the different performance opportunities that we actually have every single day and how we choose to act physically or verbally, and as part of these sort of ever-changing environments in which we live, which will one day become the past. And as much as it is intrinsic to the human experience, this is a part of our history that is really difficult to preserve. And it was really great to be able to just tease at the edges of delving into it.
Thank you, Esther. That was really, really something. What a character. How come Lola didn't never go to Spain? Did she even spoke Spanish?
No,
No?
I think she just happened to have dark hair. she'd run away with an army officer quite young after getting out of her boarding school, and sort of found herself in Europe and just decided, I think, to be like, right, this is how I'm going to brand myself and this is what I'm going to do. And yeah, countless affairs and situations later, she was going around the world with this and other performance pieces. That's
quite amazing. Your presentation and Lucy's remind me of what I was mentioning before about historical accuracy and what do we want to represent, and those searches that still happen nowadays with some historians. I'm not generalizing, like in search of the truth, like we need to find the truth. No, there's no truth. We don't want that, as you mentioned that very wisely. You also remind me of perhaps Fabio is acquainted with this example of a historian called Camila Townsend. She writes the history of Malincin, of La Malinche, who's a woman historical figure, very important in Latin America, but actually there's no historical record of her. She reconstructed all the context and her figure based on other accounts of women of the same age in the same time period. So I think that's amazing. I think that's a historical, I mean, I think that's an amazing exercise. So I have a question for both of you. In light of all that you have mentioned and said, why did you choose these particular figures to do your historical research about? Dark histories, complicated histories, the image of woman as like Lucy mentioned, like a prostitute. Why did you want to delve into those particular kind of histories and this kind of research?
I don't know which one of us is going to go first. Okay, I'll go. This is really silly, but I was always a bit of an emo kid, I have to be honest. I loved the Phantom of the Opera when I was 9 and My Chemical Romance and all of this kind of thing. So I already was just kind of drawn to music and art that had a bit more of a Gothic and 19th century touch to it. And I always loved from a young age reading biographies of kind of tragic, usually royal or aristocratic women. There's just something in that that really interested me. And then I got into miling, and at first I thought, wow, this Mary is so stupid. She's such a stupid girl, and she's such a little slut, you know, because that's a story that keeps getting repeated. And then after a while, I thought, you know what? Actually, something smells fishy. I don't like this. I feel like that there's something else behind it. So I started digging and realized that actually the historians that had been writing about this topic first, so they were much more interested in Rudolph, in the male figure. And the accessibility of the sources relating to Mary were really difficult because a lot of them had either been destroyed, they had been lost and have now been refound. For example, her farewell notes from when she died were actually found in a bank vault about 10 years ago. Or there are a lot in private hands, so I had to do a lot of digging. And I just kind of became really convicted that someone needed to tell her story as best as possible, because of course I was not there. I'm not Mary. I can't actually give her a voice literally, but I can do my best. So I just kind of felt like, you know, her mother wrote a memoir kind of trying to bring justice to Mary and her story, and also the terrible things that the imperial family and the aristocracy did to the Vetcher family after the mining incidents. So in a way, it just kind of felt like justice for Mary. I don't know. Like I said, I had these kind of bad first impressions of her. And then the more I read about her, the more I thought, okay, actually, I remember what it's like to be a 17-year-old girl. I probably wouldn't have died in a murder-suicide pact with someone, but I know what it was like to just be madly in love or in love with the idea of someone, and this kind of big romantic tendency and big emotions and this kind of thing. So yeah, I think that kind of sums it up. So half growing up an emo kid and then half just actually being fueled a little bit by anger and frustration by how her story was being told, and thinking that actually someone should change the narrative a little bit.
Thank you, Lucy.
Yeah. I'm really struck, Lucy, about, you know, that mantle of that work as well, and where miling actually sits within that as well, what it's done to Mary's legacy as well. Because yeah, you may be working on her biography in English, but obviously dealing with these really complicated histories as well. And I think for me, in some ways, there's a little bit of overlap. So I was invited to be part of the project. So in terms of the subject area, it wasn't something that of her as a historical character that I sort of stumbled upon myself. But what really came through the wider event, which obviously wasn't particularly part of this specific paper, was the idea of actually who Lola was, because her reputation is scandal and sex and affairs and glamour and things like that. And actually, when you read her own memoirs and you look into what happened in her later life, she ends up penniless. She actually ends up bumping into an old classmate from the Presbyterian boarding school from which she sort of escaped, for want of a better word, who's a very, very sincere, I think, Presbyterian or Protestant believer, and she ends up like devoting her life to faith, and she dies, we think, of some sort of STI sort of a situation when she's relatively young. But there's so much more to Lola Montez as a person. And actually in the workshop, we posited this idea that actually her and my colleague who played her sort of cousin actually had a lot in common, because Lola was seen as this black sheep of the family. She probably never met her cousin. But actually what we did through the workshop was try to change these perceptions. Be like, actually, look, you have this idea of one cousin as this sort of perfect gentlewoman, and this other one as an absolutely out there, slutty sort of stage performer. And when it comes to it, that's not necessarily the case. And there's a lot of, sense of reconciliation for reputation and legacy that dance ultimately became part of. And I think in actually trying to come up with some sort of choreography, I really had to grapple with that context of actually what we were doing and who actually Lola was, versus what's just sort of survived in terms of what we think we know about her. It's really interesting to navigate.
Can I ask you, Esther, a question about the choreography? Because this has been on my mind for years, actually, with, I have to bring up the Phantom of the Opera, of course, but I remember, learning.
I love Phantom.
Yeah, me too. It's from my wall right now. I just learning about how the show was developed, and especially the choreography, because the choreographer spoke about, kind of how ballet dancers at the time that Phantom is set, so the end of the 19th century, they held themselves differently. There was a lot lower and this kind of thing. And of course, we don't have videos. I mean, what kind of sources can we look at to kind of get a better understanding of how dance was back then? Because that really, I have to be honest, broke my brain a little bit. I'm sure there's a lot of gaps, but how do you deal with that?
I think it's quite hard. I think it's quite sad. You do find surviving footage to the early 20th century, certainly, sort of turn of the century, you can occasionally find some things. But that is pretty much as far back, if I'm thinking, I may have misremembered, but from what I can think of off the top of my head, that you can sort of find. But I think when I was trying to think about what the choreography would be, for example, with the leg lines, we know that the romantic leg lines were there because that's what's depicted in the pictures, for example. Some of the choreography you'll see in some of the big ballets, we have records of that since it was made. So Swan Lake, for example, you can actually look back and see what the choreography is. How it may be interpreted, for example, it could be a little bit different, and certainly there has been different versions. But there are some spaces where sort of records sort of exist, and then it kind of felt like it was up to me, which was what was quite difficult. And I think I had to kind of, into some senses, draw upon the more general things that I was aware of or had been made to believe or led to believe, and then kind of do my best with it. But I mean, Phantom of the Opera is a really interesting one for the legacy of a dancer and the reputation of a dancer, because certainly dancers weren't perceived particularly well back in the 19th century from what I've been made aware of. So yeah, sometimes you find bits and bobs of history where you don't always expect to find it.
I have another question, but I don't know if Fabio or Luisa have a question. I will If you have a question, please open your mic and make it, or if not, okay, go.
Yes, I have a question. Good. My English is not perfect, but I speak English. I'm very interested in the relation, in the link between history and dance. I'm studying Latin American history, so I can see in Latin American history a lot of ritual manifestations as in form of dance. No, the dance is a ritual moment for communities and is a moment for expression of histories. No, for me, it's very very interesting. No, and I it's very very interesting your topics, your activities, and I have a curiosity, yeah, for Esther and Lucia. A question is about the link between the link or relation between dance and gender, between dance and the woman in the history, no? Because really I perceive a link between a woman and dance, and my question is in the history you can find the same link, no? For example, now we was speaking about Lola, and Jimena spoke about Malinche, woman, yes, woman. And I think that maybe we can find a link, no? And or we can look for a connection in the history between the history of the dance and the gender, no? This is my curiosity. Thanks.
Yeah. That's something I'd love to explore more, to be honest. I think it's really interesting, the common themes that both of our sort of history and performance-based papers had with regards to women and legacy and reputation. I've not particularly looked to sort of ritual dance too much, although I think it will be a really interesting framework to apply to dance more broadly. I mean, the roots of ballet in sorts of court life and Louis XIV as a major proponent of ballet and things, as well as sort of early histories with like sort of Catherine de Medici. I wonder to what extent some of those sort of cultural metaphors could be really, really interesting and frameworks for the study of dance. I mean, I'd love to know more, because I agree there is a stereotypical, from what I've seen at least, association between sort of dance and women, but that might be completely false.
It is. Well, it's no, it's not completely false, but I know, for example, about the case. I mean, I'm not a historian of music, so my knowledge is very, very limited. But for example, related a little bit with what Fabio was asking, I know, for example, tango. Tango is a masculine dance.
Yeah,
I know some
Ballroom.
local dances in Colombia are just male dances because they were meant to, for example, tell or songs more. They were meant to tell news from one town to another. But I'm sure there's more to it. But I know in the recent years, I mean, you, Lucy and Esther, I'm sure you know more about this than me. There are a lot of male ballet dancers that are super famous and super good. And also I'm remembering the movie Billy Elliot. Do you remember?
Yes.
Billy Elliot?
It's one of my favorite films. That film makes me cry.
Yeah, I know little, and I know that like the first inclination is to think about dance related to women, but I think if we go to other contexts, Fabio, like the ones we work in, it doesn't.
Yeah.
It really doesn't apply. It really has to do. For example, in small scale communities, indigenous communities, the men are the only ones who have the right to dance. In some of them, not all of them. And women cannot perform certain activities, for example, when they're menstruating or things like that. So, yeah, but as I said, I know nothing about the topic. Things that came to mind.
Yeah, things are definitely changing in ballet, I think, a little bit. It's quite common now for men or boys to train with point shoes as well, whether or not they wear them for performances, for example. Ballet would be a really interesting space, I think, to explore that, because it's often so much focus on the ballerina that there's a lot more to it. And I mean, Matthew Bourne's Swan Lake, which comes into Billy Elliot as well. Have you come across anything, Lucy?
Yeah, I think that it was actually Meiling, maybe, that was kind of the first ballet that was really written with a male star in mind. I mean, Rudolph is pretty much on stage the entire time, and it's famous for being the most challenging role for a man. And the women, I mean, there are lots of women, but they're all kind of the side characters, but I don't see it in a kind of detrimental way. I mean, it's kind of telling Rudolph's story and his personal relationships. I know some people have had a bit of a problem with it in terms of seeing the women as kind of side characters with no voice. Maybe that depends on the dancer or kind of an interpretation of choreography, because I personally didn't see it like that. But yeah, Meiling was really kind of, as far as I'm aware, the ballet that kind of, I mean, you had Nureyev, for example, making the male ballet dancer into a star, but Meiling, as far as I'm aware, is kind of the ballet that brought the male dancer into focus. And because I also always thought of ballet, ballet, ballerinas, and this thing, but
they're more than pas de deux partners.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, in Meiling, maybe the women are the pas de deux partners.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that.
Because there's a lot of in Meiling, man is, the woman is kind of always in the air, and it's always the man who's kind of, it's Rudolph who's always lifting her up, and it seems to be a bit more about him than about her.
Yeah. I have a last question. It's more like opinion-based question, and I invite also the people in the audience to answer it, because I mean, I certainly don't have an answer for it. And it's in your opinion, it's the same question Lucy posed. In your opinion, should we compromise historical accuracy for ratings or entertainment? Many contemporary shows do it when addressing, for example, complicated pasts. I'm thinking about the Latin American shows about drug dealers that are so complicated. They have a fantastic rating, and they are historically complicated, let's say. However, they are success. They move lots of money. So, in your opinion, what do you think?
I think it would, I'm so conflicted about it, because on one hand, I think it depends on the story. And with Meiling, I mean, you can't condense it's so complex. It's political, it's psychological, it's family relations, and this kind of, yes, my cat wants a dinner. And so, of course, you can't condense that really easily into a 3-hour ballet or a 2-hour film. And I'm actually working now in the beginning phases of a TV show that will be episode-wise to try and tell it as accurately as possible. But I'm also not stressed about everything being perfect, because of course nothing can be perfect. I'm sure I make mistakes in my research at some points. I'm human, error happens. But like I said, with this particular story, I feel that there's kind of an ethical kind of issue, at least when it comes to Mary's story about her being a 17-year-old girl who was then kind of turned into a villain after her death, very unjustly. With other stories, so for example, there's now lots of Netflix shows about Rudolph's mother, Empress Elizabeth, and they're literally, it's just completely made up. They just take the names of the historical characters, and they are entertaining. I'm not gonna lie. At the same time, I think it's a shame. I think they, her story already is so fascinating. It would be nice if they could at least bring in some more kind of factual elements. But of course, we have to make compromises. You can't fit in such a large time span into such a short amount of time. And of course, you've got the kind of the modern lens that people are interpreting these things from. So I think it's such a gray area. And I think it's so dependent on the story, on the goals of the production, and this kind of thing. So I don't know. And that's okay.
I think for me, it very much depends on the goal of the production and what's actually involved in it. And firstly, I'm really intrigued by the fact that we're talking about this within the context of dance and performance, because this is a conversation that we have all the time with regards to film and TV, for example. But it's very unusual, or it feels to me more unusual to be able to talk about it in terms of like privileging other types of performance, like stage performance. And I think for me, it depends on what the production is trying to achieve. For what I've just said, ironically, my best example is Bridgerton, which does not seek to tell any real stories. It is a contemporary fantasy that happens to be set in a fantastical Regency period.
I love it. I've seen it all. I have to confess.
It doesn't really, to some extent, it does matter. And there's been some really important conversations around it. But you're not telling emotionally or politically charged histories. Miling kind of reopens the public memory of a scandal through stage, extremely emotive, extremely difficult topics. If I tell my family, oh yeah, I'm writing something on miling, what's miling? And I describe it, they're like, oh my goodness, why are you writing on that? Because there's some really difficult topics, really, really hard histories. And as Lucy explored really well, really important things that we still need to bring out. And I think if that is the goal, and those are the things that your show is engaging with, or there are elements of the history that need to be engaged with in order to do that topic properly, I think you have to have an element of fact versus sort of fiction, in terms of being very careful what you choose to include or exclude. Make sure you have a good reason for it, not only I think for your own peace of mind, but also because people will ask you, and the press will get at you, and they will say you scythed wrong, or that dress wasn't quite period. And as well as, you know, maybe weightier issues as well of representation. So I think it depends. I'm flexible. So in some situations, I don't really mind too much. In others, I think that's an important question that we need to think about more.
Okay, I don't
Be
know,
prepared to talk.
Fabio, yeah, if you have an opinion on that.
No special opinion. I am learning about with your opinions.
Okay, Lucy and Esther, is there something else you would love to address? A closing statement, closing thoughts? Would you like people to invite you to see you performing, for example?
I mean, I don't have anything personally. I have not got any more currently scheduled Learn Montez workshops coming up.
Shame. Actually, cool idea. I really want to see that.
It was good fun. But have you got anything coming up, Lucy?
Well, I filmed this French TV show, that the Secrets of History, about miling already, I think, a year and a half ago, and they still don't know when it's going to be aired. So look out for
takes
it
ages.
at some point.
Let us
will
know.
be. Yeah,
Yes, please do.
my book is coming. It's just super delayed because I'm working on this project about Moritz Neer. So eventually, at some point, the book will be published, but don't ask me when, please.
Also, no, but also let us know. Also let us
It'll
know.
be very valuable.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Well, thank you very much, Lucy and Esther, for this session. I wasn't expecting it. It was great. It was mind-opening for me, because I was really intrigued about the connections about public history and dance, and you delivered that perfectly. I actually want to know more. I'm very grateful for it. So thank you very much. Just for the audience, people who are seeing us and who's watching the video, Explorers will take a break in August, and we will back in September. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamina. Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you both. Thank you, everyone, for coming.